I'm just continuing thinking about dualism, which I started talking about a few minutes ago, and then promptly dropped my phone and lost it. But what I'm thinking about, again in relation to a paper that I'm trying to write, is to do with the relationship between dualism as an inherent part of human being and the optimization of performance, doing things better, mastery, all those kind of things really. And what I'm up to with that thinking really is this idea that we are kind of inherently dualist. There's nothing physical to support that assumption, but that seems to be an assumption that is part of our, not just our naive psychology actually, but just part of our understanding of ourselves. That we feel as if we're some kind of mind in a body, or some kind of ephemeral, unextended spirit in some kind of material substance. Even though that, as I say, that's probably completely fallacious. That's how it feels, and that seems to be innate and universal, and almost impossible to disabuse oneself of. So what's the relationship between that necessary dualism and optimization of performance? Is there a relationship? Well, one of the things I've been thinking about prior to this is about the variable relationships between those two components of that duality, between mind and body, if you like, or consciousness and action, or some kind of relationships between that. And one of the things I think that comes into play in relation to mastery and excellence is to do with a very tight identification between those two, or between the various components that are implied with that dualism, to the extent that that the feeling of dualism is suppressed, even if the actuality of it constantly keeps kind of reasserting itself. So what I'm thinking of here is things like Csikszentmihalyi's idea of flow, in which he identifies particular mental states associated with high performance in sport, in work, of all kinds of things, and this relationship to things like happiness, but particularly in relation to performance. And flow as a kind of mental state seems to carry with it this sense of there being no sense of duality going on. One feels oneself to be unproblematically engaged in the activity. You forget one's sense of a separate self. You lose yourself in the activity. Time seems to stop. You take no notice of the environment in which you're lodged. All those kind of things happen to you. Your ego is kind of dissolved into the activity. As I say, he calls it flow. And to me that seems to be not actually a dissolving of the duality at all, actually, I think, even though that may be what it feels like. I think it's closer to a seamless integration, or a seamless mapping of one's sense of self with, let's call it sense of self, that kind of spirit-mind thing, with the activity and the body carrying out that activity, so that there's no separation. Even though separation is inherent, that separation isn't in operation at that moment. I think you also find it in terms like absorption, which I know Gershwitz talks about, and I think Merleau-Ponty as well, in which again and that's associated with excellence. You go through, as I understand it, when you're learning an activity, you go through various stages of learning, in which one is variously engaged in that. But when one is approaching the condition of excellence, one feels oneself to be absorbed. And again, it's a very revealing term, I think, that there is a kind of dissolving of those two components of that duality into a singularity. But again, I would say that that's not quite true, in the sense I'm not sure it's a dissolving as a very close mapping or a very close matching, correlation. Where else do you find it? I think you also find it in Goffman's idea of unself-conscious engrossment. So when you're engrossed in an activity to a certain level, then you're, as the term implies, unself-consciously engrossed. There is no self apparent, which isn't to say the self isn't there, it's just mapped very closely onto the activity and the body carrying out that activity. I think you also find it in things like Zen. I'm thinking of Zen and archery here, the Harriman text, in which expertise in archery in that particular example is accompanied by a feeling of complete identification with all of the activities and all of the components of the activity. So there is the bow, the arrow, the flight of the arrow, the archer, the tension in the bowstring. All of those things are one thing happening, and that's supposedly a state that one would wish to achieve because it correlates to expertise and excellence in archery. I know there's also quite a bit of evidence for that correlation between that kind of absorption, that kind of singularity with excellence in sport. I know there's been quite a bit of research done on, again, to do with flow, for example, but to do with particular brain states correlating to alpha waves, I think, in which at the peak of your abilities, when you're an elite sports person, you perform best on the day, and that's really important, if you are in the zone, as they say. And being in the zone has all the same features of being in flow, of being absorbed, of being one with the activity. There's this unproblematic sense of mastery, complete one-to-one mapping of oneself with the activity one is doing, to the extent that one can't feel the separation, complete identification. So one is the action, one is the body, one is the sport, and excellence follows from there. I think there's also a really tantalizing piece of research being done on telepresence and mastery in video games, and performance excellence in virtual environments, which are a kind of dualist environment par excellence, really, in which one tends to perform better in a video game or in a virtual environment if one feels oneself to be totally identified with the avatar, with the character that one is engaged with in that environment. The extent to which you feel you are not present in the game is the extent to which you are likely to underperform. So again, I think there's a sense in which that identification with the action and the physical circumstances, all the physical circumstances surrounding the action, that close matching of those dual components correlates to excellence. It does require, of course, I haven't mentioned this before, but it does require that skill precedes it. You can't just a simple kind of getting into the flow state or getting unself-consciously engrossed in and of itself isn't necessarily a guarantor of excellence. But if you have already acquired the skills, then you can best mobilize those skills by entering into that kind of apparently non-dual state, by the careful mobilization of duality such that the two components come into good alignment.